Welcome, everyone. We're so excited to have you joining us today. My name is Anne-Marie Fannin, and I'm the director of the Work-Learn Institute at the University of Waterloo. A quick housekeeping note before we get started, there will be time for Q&A towards the end of the presentation. However, if you do have any questions as we go through the presentation, feel free to use the stage pane on the right-hand side of your hop-in window, and you can pop your questions into the chat. We'll do our best to answer as many questions as possible throughout the presentation and, of course, during the Q&A. Before we go any further, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm presenting to you today from the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples, and I respectfully acknowledge their ancestors and elders past and present. The University of Waterloo's main campus is situated on the Haldimand Tract, the land promised to the Six Nations that includes 6 miles on either side of the Grand River. As we come together today, we're gathering on other traditional lands across our country. I acknowledge the enduring presence and deep traditional laws, knowledge, and philosophies of the many Indigenous peoples with whom we share these lands today. So many of you may be quite familiar with the University of Waterloo, and this slide just highlights a few aspects about what make our university and our co-op program unique. The University of Waterloo was the first post-secondary institution in Canada to offer the cooperative model of education, and we now run the world's largest program of its kind with over 25,000 students completing work terms in a global network of over 7,500 employers. And of course, Waterloo is home to the Work-Learn Institute. At the Work-Learn Institute, we establish and promote quality standards for work-integrated learning. We conduct and we share research, and we explore new models and approaches to talent development. We're so pleased to be the hosts of this Future Ready Workforce series, and we look forward to sharing additional insights with you as to how to best connect with the next generation of talent in the months ahead. So, as you might have guessed by the title of this session, today's webinar focuses on the critical subject of lifelong learning. During our time together, we'll identify the attributes of lifelong learners, and we'll discuss some of Work-Learn's research studies that focused on the importance of having a lifelong learning mindset and the connection between that lifelong learning mindset and organizational success. We'll share some tactics for identifying lifelong learners as a part of your recruitment processes, and we'll talk about the importance of nurturing lifelong learning to drive innovation within your organization. I'm so pleased to have 2 great guest speakers joining me today on this topic. So first we have Dr. David Drury, who is Work-Learn's Associate Director and was the lead researcher on many of our studies focused on lifelong learning. We're also elated to have Melanie Skeppers, Vice President of Human Resources at GEOTAB, joining us today. GEOTAB was one of Waterloo's Employer Impact Award winners, and when you hear Melanie speak about some of their programs, you'll understand why. Today, she'll share a few ways that GEOTAB helps to nurture lifelong learning for all of their employees, which will hopefully spark some ideas for you. Thank you so much, Dave and Melanie, for joining us today. So let's dive right in. The need for lifelong learning strategies is gaining prominence across Canada and around the world. But oftentimes when we talk about lifelong learning, we do so in terms of skills. So say the shortened shelf life of technical skills and knowledge bases, which will of course necessitate continuous upskilling and reskilling of our workforces. So for example, we're all adapting to advances in technology and thinking about or already dealing with the ways in which artificial intelligence and automation will dramatically change not only our day-to-day tasks, but our industries and our organizations as a whole. However, this is really only one component of why lifelong learning will be so important for all of us. It's really a combination of monumental shifts or megatrends that are dramatically changing the nature of our societies and our societal and our business priorities that are highlighting the urgency to create a population of lifelong learners. In 2019, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development identified 5 megatrends: advances in technology, globalization and the expansion of global value chains, demographic changes, migration, and climate change, as combining to make lifelong learning absolutely imperative, not only for economic growth, but for social well-being. So this isn't just a question of continuous learning or creating training programs for new technologies and processes. It's about building resilience, adaptability, and learning agility in our population so that we can all manage the constant change and develop the new and higher levels of skills, including those human skills that will be needed to thrive. So before we go any further, let's dive a little bit deeper into the definition of lifelong learning. Lifelong learning is quite simply the process of learning throughout life. But there are 2 aspects of this definition that are implicit, related to each other, and absolutely critical to understanding the concept of lifelong learning. The first is that lifelong learning is not constrained to higher education or formal training. It includes all of the things that people do to learn, including those that happen outside of the confines of traditional training programs throughout their lives. Second, and relatedly, lifelong learning is typically viewed as self-directed and learner-centric. At the Work Learn Institute, our interest has been in understanding the individual differences that might explain who is most likely to participate in lifelong learning. So we've focused on the characteristics that seem to be most useful for describing lifelong learners, and we've studied how those characteristics support both individual and organizational success. Over the next few slides, we'll share a little bit about some of the research that we've done on these 2 topics and what they might mean for your organization. But before we do that, we want to hear your perspectives. So when you think of someone who you would describe as a lifelong learner, what are some of the characteristics that come to mind for you? And we're hoping that you can share by popping these into the chat. We'll give you a minute to put them in, and then we'll come back and review them before we move on with our research studies. As you do that, I'll add a little bit of additional context on the subject of lifelong learning. So when we talk about lifelong learning, we want to address it from 2 different perspectives. First, the system level perspective. So that addresses the systems such as training programs and educational institutions that provide opportunities for lifelong learning and the structures that support it. So while it's true that lifelong learning isn't contained or constrained to formal training programs, there are system level structures that we can put in place to help nurture and foster lifelong learning. And then, of course, we have the individual level perspective. So concerned with the individual, the characteristics of a human that might promote the pursuit of lifelong learning. In today's webinar, we'll talk about both perspectives on lifelong learning. So we'll look at some examples of system level opportunities or structures that could help to foster lifelong learning, as well as the characteristics of lifelong learners. So speaking of which, let's take a look at what you put in the chat, and I will pass things off to my colleague Dave Drury to summarize that and to share some of our research findings.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Anne. I'm really excited to see everyone posting in the chat. Just wanted to review a couple of the submissions here. Folks like Calvin and Paige right off the bat, Christine, Wendy, Colin, another Colin said curiosity or lifelong learners are curious. There's mentions of words like driven and enthusiastic. I'm seeing curiosity again. Simon Guthrie says strategic thinking. Thanks, Simon. We're going to get back to that in a moment. Really, really happy to see that sort of submission. Curiosity, by and large, seems to be the most popular submission. Wayne Johnson offers self-aware, big picture thinking, very, very similar to that strategic thinking. So this is really exciting to hear because my personal opinion is that we feel the exact same way that the audience does about a lot of this. We asked ourselves this exact same question several years ago. What characteristics, what terms seem to be most useful to characterize people that would be described by others as lifelong learners? And to answer that, we reviewed decades worth of literature about the topic of lifelong learning and lifelong learners. And we noticed that descriptions varied pretty widely. Some focused on specific behaviors like reading for pleasure, and others were broad, sort of focusing on things like how people think about learning in general. But there was definitely some common threads. Across all of the definitions, we noticed that three concepts were always emergent. And these concepts, we think, which the audience seems to be very aware of, I think help us better understand the characteristics of lifelong learners. The first of those is, you guessed it, curiosity. Perhaps above all else, we think that lifelong learners have an insatiable curiosity. They just want to learn, or more than that, they need to learn. They need to know how things work. In the workplace, this may manifest as proactive information seeking. You can sort of imagine people who ask those why type questions. Why do we do it like this? Why does it work like that? They're seeking to understand and ultimately preparing themselves to make things even better. Second, strategic thinking. Lifelong learners are definitely strategic thinkers. They have this really innate ability to track what they know and what they need to know. They set goals that are aligned with some sort of large or big picture vision towards learning new things. And they seem to be really good at transferring what they know from one setting into another setting. For example, imagine someone who worked in one organization, developed skills there, working on a certain problem, and now they work in a new job and they say, well, this is a different job, but what did I learn in my last job that might prepare me for solutions in this other one? They're really good at making that sort of transfer across contexts. And finally, lifelong learners are resilient learners. They are resilient to the challenges that inevitably show up in any process and any time people are trying to learn something new. All of us bump up against these sort of challenges, but the thing that really distinguishes the population from people who are described as lifelong learners is resiliency, which is kind of obvious. It makes sense because resiliency is key to the whole lifelong aspect of lifelong learning. And so those three aspects together, we think are really useful for describing lifelong learners. Most of the research about lifelong learning and lifelong learners is conducted by folks who are interested in educational policy. Picture people from backgrounds like educational research or sociology. And we're definitely interested in that sort of stuff too at the Work Learn Institute. But in the last couple of years, we've tried to go in a different direction. We also developed an interest in understanding how students and new graduates and others in the workforce contribute to their organizations. And as part of that interest, we conducted a series of studies to better understand the relationship between the development of these sort of curiosity type traits that we're talking about and various markers of organizational success. And what I'd like to do in this slide here is just share a few highlights of that research for you. So the first thing we found was that lifelong learners seem to be better able to adjust to a new workplace. And this is pretty big. Think about it. Whenever your organization makes a new hire, it has to go through an onboarding process. And the goal, regardless of what your organization looks like, is always the same. It's to take someone who's an organizational outsider and transform them into an organizational insider. And based on the literature around lifelong learners, we thought maybe these traits, these characteristics might have something to do with that. So we surveyed co-op students about their lifelong learning characteristics. And then later at the end of a 4-month-long work experience, we asked them questions about how well they adjusted to their job. And we found that the higher participants score on our measure of lifelong learning characteristics, the greater their reports of adjustment in terms of things like how well they thought they understood their role and how it was situated in the organization, and also their feelings of social acceptance into the organization. Beyond that, we also found that lifelong learning characteristics have implications for employee performance at work. And this is obviously of interest because all organizations are interested in squeaking out just a little bit more performance, just that little higher performance in any particular organizational member. In a student sample, we found that lifelong learning scores were positively associated with self-reported performance. People who scored higher also scored higher on things like they were more proactive, they were better at adapting to challenges, and they were also more pro-social. So they were more willing to help out others at work during their co-op work term. But here's the thing. We also found in 2 other samples that lifelong learning scores were associated with greater supervisor-rated performance on measures like problem solving and quality and quantity of work. So it isn't just that lifelong learners think that they're somehow better at doing their job. Their supervisors actually think so too. And third, we found that lifelong learners tend to be happier at work. We surveyed nearly 200 alumni of Waterloo's School of Accounting and Finance program, and we asked them to complete a measure of lifelong learning characteristics. And then we also asked them to complete measures about their experience at work, things like job satisfaction or work engagement and their confidence to do their work. And we found that all those things pointed in the same direction. The higher their scores on our measure of lifelong learning, the more satisfied they were with the work that they were doing, the more engaged they were. They reported like they were more willing to get out of bed and go to work, and the greater their confidence to accomplish their tasks. So think about it. All these results point in the same direction. They all suggest that lifelong learners are desirable to your organization. They're more successful during onboarding early when they enter into the organization. And once they're set up for success, lifelong learners also seem to accomplish their tasks and even go above and beyond their role to help others. And while they're doing this, they seem to be having a good time, which is important for building long-term relationships with the organization. And we think it has implications for individual health and well-being at work, which is obviously a huge HR issue in the last couple of years. So I'm going to pause there. Those are some high-level insights based on the last couple of years of research that we've been doing on the contributions of lifelong learners to organizations. But you don't want to just hear it from me. You want to hear it from those in industry. And we're really excited today to have Melanie, who Anne introduced earlier, join us to talk a little bit about what all of this means from an industry leader like GEOTAB. So thanks, Melanie. Over to you.
Thank you, Dave, and thank you to the Work Learn Institute and the University of Waterloo for having me today. So let me first start by introducing GEOTAB to all of you. So GEOTAB is an engineering firm. We are based out of Oakville, Ontario. We are a global leader in connected vehicles and IoT solutions, and we have seen tremendous growth over the past number of years. Most recently, we have surpassed our 2,000 employee mark globally. Next slide. We have also been recognized as one of the fastest growing technology firms and have received numerous awards and accolades, including being one of Canada's best managed companies, as well as a great place to work for young people. As mentioned earlier, we were also very honored to be the recipient of the 2020 Impact on Innovation Award presented from the University of Waterloo. So at GEOTAB, we believe that lifelong learning leads to curious and innovative employees. There are many different ways that organizations can help develop and nurture lifelong learners within their organization. At GEOTAB, we have a number of initiatives and programs in place to do just that. For example, we offer a tuition reimbursement program for continuing education so that our employees can seek alternative learning opportunities outside of the organization. We have developed GEOTAB book clubs where our teams can connect on business topics of interest. We also have a really awesome mentorship program. So leaders and peer groups can come together and learn from each other at work. We recently launched a career exploration program, which is another awesome initiative that allows employees within the organization to learn about other departments within the company and other career opportunities so that they can seek career changes and new roles directly in the organization without having to leave GEOTAB. We also have a campus program and an upskilling program that I'm going to talk about in more detail in the next slide. So we are very proud of the GEOTAB campus program. This program has evolved over the years, but at its core, the purpose of the program is to really support the next generation of workers with hands-on learning experiences. So we believe that internships should have a purpose, right? So our interns gain real-world experiences by participating in impactful projects within the teams that they intern with. We seek to fully integrate our interns into our GEOTAB's teams, so they also complete our onboarding experience when they join us. We also have our interns go through an end of session intern challenge. So this is a great opportunity for our interns and our students to present on what they learned during their time at GEOTAB to their peer group. So during our student internships, our students are able to use their educational background to participate in real-world problems while gaining insights and knowledge with on-the-job training. They're also able to work directly with industry experts to continue to develop their skills. And in many cases, the students are able to secure permanent employment with GEOTAB after their internship. So I talked earlier about lifelong learning leading to curious employees and innovation. And I very much see innovation come out of our internship program with much success. I did want to talk about two particular examples to highlight this. So one being Tabber. So Tabber is actually a networking program that was developed by one of our University of Waterloo interns over the past year. So this program matches willing participants, so employees in the organization, randomly with other employees in an effort to meet and network with each other. We found that with GEOTAB's rapid growth, as well as the restrictions that we faced over the course of the pandemic, that this was such an amazing opportunity for our employees to stay connected and also meet new people while working from home. Another really great example of innovation within our internship program was a student that we had on board for a 4-month term. This student was given the task of building a feature for one of our products, and it was actually supposed to be completed over the 4-month term. But after a short period of time in the role, we actually had an urgent request from the customer who needed the feature done quite quickly. This intern was able to quickly assess the situation, figure out what was required using their educational experience. They were able to implement the feature, test it, and actually had the opportunity to demo it directly with the customer. This ultimately led to a very happy customer, as you can imagine, and gave the student that opportunity to contribute in a meaningful and impactful way to the needs of our business. So I also mentioned an upskilling program. So our upskilling program is in place to teach employees new skills that will assist them with their work. We've seen many benefits of implementing an upskilling program, some of which Dave commented on already, but we have seen higher motivation and engagement with this. We've also seen the ability to reduce the need to recruit outside of our organization. So in situations where maybe there's a particular skill set that we're looking for in the market, and we saw this where it was very challenging, maybe a niche role, we actually found a huge benefit in taking that skill and allowing our current employees to upskill and learn that skill. That greatly helped the recruitment process and allowed us to actually move people internally rather than spending time looking for that skill set out in the market. It enhances the skills that are available across our teams through this program, and ultimately leads to increased growth opportunities for our employees, which can include things like internal promotions and just moves within the organization.
to it, Steph, and I love the example of the upskilling program that you have and the ways in which it has assisted with retention and internal promotion. One of the things that I'm curious about, though, is if you try to seek out lifelong learners as a part of your recruitment process, and if so, how do you do so?
Yes. Thank you, Anne. So absolutely. I think there are many things that we can do as hiring managers or talent acquisition teams to recruit lifelong learners into the organization. So the first thing that I would say is trying to weave the three characteristics of lifelong learners, so curiosity, strategic thinking, and resiliency, right into the recruitment process. So being able to formulate questions for the candidate that would give you more insight into these traits. I have an example here, which I really like this question. Tell me something you have taught yourself in the last 6 months. I think that this really allows the recruiter to understand from the candidate if they are proactive in their learning, right? If they are curious. So being able to kind of pull that out of candidates, I think would be really important. A couple of other tips that I would say from the recruiting standpoint would be to look at the employee's education and interest in education. So that usually provides their clues into, whether they're interested in continuing to learn and what that desire to continue to learn looks like. Look for a variety of skills. So candidates who have a passion for learning will likely demonstrate that on their resume by having, a number of skills in place. Also showing additional certifications or designations will give you clues to that as well. Capitalizing on candidate questions too can be helpful. So when a candidate asks you directly, what is GEOTAB looking for? This really opens the door for the recruiter to share what we're looking for as an organization, right? So we want those people with the initiative. We want those people with that spark to learn. And the last thing I would say is even learning about a candidate's personal interests, hobbies, activities also can provide some really good insight to their desire to learn, especially outside of the classroom.
That's great. Thanks so much, Melanie. The recommendations are fantastic, practical, and probably not surprisingly align with what we would say as well. So that simple but powerful question, asking a candidate about something that they've taught themselves recently, is a really great strategy. And as you know, we would be looking for those hallmarks of curiosity, strategic thinking, and resiliency and their response. So for example, out of curiosity, I'd be interested in understanding why the candidate chose to learn what they did. Was it mandated or identified as a skills gap for them by someone else, or were they just interested in something that might affect their day-to-day job or their lives? And then under strategic thinking, I'd be looking for a system for their learning. So did they go about it in a strategic way that would help them achieve their learning goals efficiently? And then finally, under resiliency, I'd be looking for evidence that the candidate saw the learning through to their desired outcome, and that they were able to overcome the many distractions and barriers that Dave mentioned earlier that can often get in the way of our attempts to learn, especially when we take that learning on ourselves. There was a recent Harvard Business Review article by Mark Zhao Sanders, and he offers a few specific tactics and strategies for identifying lifelong learners during recruitment. I thought it might be valuable to share some of them because they do so closely align with some of the things that we've already been discussing. So he also makes the suggestion that we ask the candidates about something that they've learned recently, and he adds that probe of how might you use that skill in the position that you're applying for. And I think that one's really interesting because it speaks to that skill transfer that we see with strategic thinkers that Dave mentioned earlier. And then, of course, there are just a couple of general tips. So first of all, be really inclusive in your definition of learning. This goes back to that notion that lifelong learning really does occur quite often outside of the confines of traditional education programs and that kind of thing. So YouTube videos, books, online courses, they're all really great ways to show that a candidate has a lifelong learning mindset and the resourcefulness to find ways to teach themselves. This isn't, of course, to say that the formal credentials aren't important, but depending on your role, if you find a candidate that's continuously thinking about their own learning and is resourceful in filling their skill gaps, chances are that you've stumbled across a lifelong learner in that applicant pool. And then to your comment about questions, as a recruiter, you should keep your eyes open for candidates that are going to ask you explicitly about the learning opportunities that you have within your organization. And my recommendation would be that you're prepared to showcase the ways in which you have a lifelong learning culture and the opportunities for growth and development, because lifelong learners are going to be looking for those organizations, the organizations that have that kind of culture. And if you aren't prepared or are ready to be able to demonstrate those kinds of opportunities to the candidate, they might find the role less appealing. So with that, I'm going to pass things back to Dave. He'll share a little bit more about some of our research studies that focused specifically on work-integrated learning and lifelong learning.
Pardon me, everyone. I was mic'd for a second there. I'm seeing in the chat there's a question about how can we develop people to mentor lifelong learners. And I think that's one step away from what I'm about to talk about here, which is how do we as institutes of higher education, as organizations, mobilize our resources to develop people to have these sort of characteristics? What do we actually do? That was a question that was burning for us in the Work Learn Institute over the last little while. And given that we're at Waterloo, the world's largest cooperative education program, we explored potential contributions of participating in work-integrated learning programs to those sorts of characteristics. And I just want to share a little bit about what we learned there. In a series of studies, we found that the further that students progressed in their co-op program, so for example, like if they had completed 3 or 4 work terms where they went out and they worked for 2 years worth of time versus those who had just started their program, they rated much higher on our measures of lifelong learning. For example, we asked supervisors to rate students on items like how well those students identified areas for improvement in their own learning and how well those students proactively address those. And we noticed that the more work terms students had completed, the higher their supervisors rated those items, meaning that the more senior students, the ones with more work experience, the ones who had progressed further into their co-op program, actually were seen by their supervisors more like a lifelong learner compared to those who just started out. In another study, we produced a similar result. We asked research assistants to take a bunch of written reflections that students at Waterloo complete at the end of their work terms. They get these sort of reflection type questions and they write about their experiences and what they've learned. We gave those to the research assistants, and we also gave those research assistants a rubric that reflected the dimensions of lifelong learning we've talked about here today. And we said, we asked them to read through the reflections and use the rubric to score each one. And then we compared the scores at the end of the day to how many work terms the students had completed. And we found the exact same thing that we did with the supervisor study. The more work terms students completed, the higher their rubric scores. What's really interesting about that is that the research assistants and the people they were reading about never met. They never met each other. So all of these biases that might happen, that might be introduced between supervisors and students, that might encourage supervisors to just provide a more favorable assessment of individuals, was taken off the table. We can't really explain these results just because the person using the rubric liked the person they were rating. So it really suggests that the people who had more work experiences were writing about what they learned in such a way that convinced the person rating them, wow, these people sound like a lifelong learner. Or said differently, there was something powerful about going out to work and coming back to the university and learning and repeating that several times that helps students write about their experiences from this perspective of lifelong learning. It helped them almost like situate their learning experiences in a bigger picture where they realized, you know what, boy, I really got to keep learning as I get older. The challenges at work are so profound that I can't just stop at the end of my program. I have to keep learning and getting better. And that showed up in what they were reflecting on. We don't really know exactly why this happens. We don't really know exactly how to explain the positive contribution of participating in work integrated learning. But we think it probably has something to do with exposure to authentic work experiences. If you kind of think about it, imagine you're a co-op student working with a software developer at GEOTAB. It would be astounding to see how much others around you actually know and how quickly things change on a day-to-day basis. Programming languages that might be in vogue in 1 year are out of style 2 years later, or there's some new technique that you're learning in class that is hot on the market one day, and then 4 years later, you've got to be learning something else. And we think that being in the workplace around these sorts of people really showcases to students early in their kind of learning journey that they have to develop curiosity and resiliency. We also think that co-op programs, like the one at Waterloo in particular, offer these really powerful opportunities for scaffolding learning. If you're not aware, how it works at Waterloo is students will go from an academic term to a workplace and back and forth and back and forth. And typically they'll do that 4, maybe even 5 times before they graduate. And each time there's mechanisms that the university offers to help students kind of think about integrating the experiences, taking what they learned at work and bringing that back into the classroom, and taking what they've done in the classroom and bringing that to work. And that sort of scaffolding seems to be an important way in which students learn that they've got to keep getting better over time. So it's still early days in our understanding of why co-op seems to help, but those are 2 really important potential explanations for what's going on. We also looked at this from the perspective of employers. We wanted to know, is there some sort of benefit to employers coming into a co-op program, participating in a co-op program, regarding their access to lifelong learners? Because at this point, you've probably said, okay, well, geez, my organization really needs to find people with these characteristics, but where do I actually go to find that? And so we asked the question, is it possible that co-op helps them find these people? And what we did was we sat down with a series of talent managers, people who might be middle managers or frontline supervisors, or as high up as CEO in organizations. And we asked them questions about the sort of people that they wanted to bring into their organization and where they were going to find those people. And these organizations, or these representatives, were all from organizations who were already hiring from Waterloo's co-op program. And many of them were hiring from other co-op programs as well. And we found a couple interesting things. The first was that most managers, or most of these talent managers, were talking about their desire for lifelong learners. Very few of them actually used that term. A lot of them said, I want people who are curious. I want people who are strategic thinkers, problem solvers. I want people who are resilient to challenges. But those responses totally mapped onto our conceptualization of lifelong learners. And honestly, it was more profound than I thought. I thought we were going to hear, oh, I want people with technical skills, and then I'll just train them on these other things. And it was actually the exact opposite. What we found was that managers were saying, I want people who have learned how to learn. And if they can do that, I'll take it from there. I'll teach them the things that they need to know to be successful in my organization. But I come to co-op programs because there's some secret sauce there that helps these people see the big picture. And they really like that. We also found that there were these mechanisms that the co-op program offered that helped reduce risk and transfer responsibility from the organization back to the university, that really helped them think that going into the co-op program to search for these people was a no-brainer. One of them, the sort of more obvious stuff, is that at places like Waterloo, there are services like interview day services. There's a physical building. There's a dedicated team of talented staff members who can help organizations think about how to onboard, think about how to recruit in ways that they wouldn't typically have if they just went out to the general population. When they develop a relationship with a place like Waterloo, it actually takes some of the effort that would normally take to find these people and puts it back on the university and the co-op program, which they absolutely loved. And the second thing is, because students are kind of more junior in their careers, because they are impressionable at that age and they're seeking place to attach themselves to, they're still kind of searching for a career. It's a really amazing time for organizations to showcase what the experience of working in their organization would look like. If you think about it, someone in a co-op program might work in your organization for 4 months, and then they might go back to school. But at the end of that program, we found that these talent managers were reaching back out to their students to say, congratulations on your degree. Do you remember us? We loved having you, and we think that you'd be a great addition to our organization. Why don't you come on back? And it was hugely effective from the organization's perspective, because that person is typically already familiar with organizational culture and policies and procedures. So not only do they have this sort of background that helps them enter back into the organization more seamlessly, but through their participation in co-op, they've developed all of these characteristics that the organization wants to find. And finally, and kind of relatedly, we found that when co-op students enter into the organization, and when the organization invests in those students, in their learning opportunities and their development, it's a really unique opportunity to build organizational commitment with those individuals. So again, kind of relatedly, we found that there was all these talent managers who had these recruitment or retention programs in mind, where they thought, okay, well, I'm going to hire this many co-op students and I'm going to track them throughout the years. And I expect that I'm going to be able to convert those into full-time employees, or at least some portion of them by the time they graduate. And based on some conversations we've had with organizations who do this really well, it's a wildly effective human resources management practice. If you can get these students into the talent pipeline early on, they tend to stick around. And it all requires showing up and developing relationships with a place like Waterloo. And obviously, it's not just a Waterloo thing. We studied Waterloo as an example of how these relationships are built and how talent managers are going about finding really talented young lifelong learners. It's possible that happens in other locations, but we found that among this sample of talent managers anyway, it seemed to work really well when they developed a relationship with Waterloo. So it's just a brief overview, some insight that you might be curious about regarding the relationship between work-integrated learning and what it has to do with the development of lifelong learners, and why your organization might be interested in coming to a place like Waterloo to find them. And I'm going to send it back over to Anne.
Great. Thanks so much, Dave. So we've had a bit of an overview of what lifelong learning is, some of the characteristics associated with lifelong learners, some strategies that we can put into place, some programming to nurture lifelong learners, and then, of course, the connection between work-integrated learning and lifelong learners. As we've been chatting, we've had a few questions come in, so I will moderate the questions and pass them along to Melanie and Dave. And Melanie will start out with a pretty straightforward one for you. So for your tuition reimbursement program, do you reimburse 100% of the tuition, even if it isn't directly related to the staff member's job?
Sure. So good question. So I think the first thing that I would just start off by saying is I think each organization has the ability to craft a program or a policy around this, depending on what works for them. One of the things from our reimbursement program is, we obviously want to encourage employees to use continuing education if they'd like to. It doesn't have to necessarily be specific to the job that they're doing today. And I think that lends back to that whole upskilling conversation as well, right? So if there is an interest in continuing education, a course or a seminar, even a degreed program, right, that might not directly be related to the job they're doing today, but could maybe help them progress or grow within the organization. That's something that we're definitely open to.
That's great. Thanks so much, Melanie. The next question that we have here, I'm going to pass to you, Dave, to see if you have thoughts on this based on the literature review that WorkLearn did. So we have a question from Julie asking whether there are links between lifelong learners and those with a growth mindset.
That's a tough one. No softballs from Julie. Thanks for the question. So just to recap, the growth mindset is a topic or a construct that was popularized in the early 2000s by Carol Dweck. Carol Dweck's an educational psychologist. I think the short answer here is that they're probably pretty similar. The growth mindset is like one polar opposite of a fixed mindset. Basically, in the research that Carol and others have done, they asked typically like elementary age students, to what extent do you think that you can actually get better over time? Or do you think your intelligence is just what it is? You were born with a certain level of intelligence. I think that the lifelong learning mindset implies a growth mindset. I'm not sure you could find someone that you would describe as a lifelong learner who would have a fixed mindset. It's implicit that someone with a lifelong learning mindset believes that they can get better over time. I think that's the short answer. The longer answer is probably that the lifelong learning mindset, based on the assumption that people feel like they can grow over time, asks more the question of why is that? Or what are the component parts involved in that sort of mindset? And we've talked today a little bit about curiosity as being a key one, something that people feel like they're intrinsically motivated to do instead of it being like a mandate, you got to go learn something, or my parents told me I had to go to school. They just wake up and they're like, I'm so fascinated to learn this. So that's a key one. And then the resilience piece is another really big one. Something bad happens, I screwed up on a test, or I tried to learn something and I didn't get it right on the first time. That's okay. I'm going to keep getting better. And then the strategic thinking part, I don't think is really covered very well in the growth mindset. And it's kind of crucial to lifelong learning, because in the conversation around lifelong learning, we also talk a lot about life-wide learning, meaning that lifelong learning is not just situated in higher education. Lifelong learners do it all the time in all sorts of settings. They could be in a volunteer job. They might just read books for their own pleasure. And it's the ability to take what they've learned in one setting and apply it somewhere else that is a really crucial characteristic of who they are. And I'm not sure that that's covered off very well in the growth mindset. So there's a lot of what we took away from reviewing the growth mindset literature and built some of that into how we think about lifelong learners. They're definitely similar, but I think they're also sufficiently different to consider them two different things.
Great. Thanks, Dave. Maybe that's something we can add into some future lifelong learning research as well. I'm going to take this next question and ask it of both of you. Melanie, maybe you can start. So do you have any examples or thoughts from your work at GEOTAB about how you can help develop supervisors and managers to become effective mentors of lifelong learners?
That's a great question. I think, I think understanding sort of how they view themselves as learners is sort of an important first step. I think that as a leader, if I was looking to be able to mentor my own staff in this area, I would probably look to others in the organization that are doing it successfully, right? So going back to that whole idea of mentorship and the cycle of mentorship. So I would probably recommend that. I think, one of the big things that we talk about at GEOTAB often is the idea of having individual development plans for our employees too. So being able as a leader to have those conversations with your employees about learning initiatives and actually create development plans for them that would include learning initiatives in there and maybe some upskilling or continuing education, I think will help leaders that don't really necessarily know how to push that on their staff. We also can make it something that is led by the employee, right? So those development plans, I think, are a great way to start that conversation and to get the employees thinking about it.
I think that's a great answer, Melanie. What I might add on it is really when we look at some of the examples of the structures that we can put in place, as you've said, whether it's a personal development plan, a professional development plan, those opportunities for continuous learning, if we as organizations give supervisors and managers the tools to empower their staff to be lifelong learners, that's a first step. And of course, the other piece that I would say, it's going to depend very much on your context and your internal structures, but keeping your eyes open for that curiosity and trying to find ways to foster it as a manager, as a supervisor, when you see it in your staff. Is there an opportunity to help that staff member learn, perhaps by putting them on a specific project team? Is there something in the questions that they're asking that you might want to be open to, of exploring how a process could be rejigged, redeveloped? And I'll draw on some other research that we did just with students in the workplace, that they often bring these really great questions and that sense of curiosity, but they won't do so unless they feel like there's a space that is inviting of that. So that might be my fundamental piece of advice to managers and supervisors, to know what the characteristics of a lifelong learner are, and to look at your organizational structures and think about how you can actually support that curiosity, the strategic thinking, and what structures you can put in place to help build that resiliency of lifelong learning. Dave, I don't know if you have anything you wanted to add on that one.
Not necessarily on that one. I'm just reading another question from Frank in the chat here. Do I have time to address that one?
Yeah, absolutely.
So Frank asked the $64,000 question. How do you look at a whole group of people? Say you've got 100 job candidates, and we've demonstrated the importance of lifelong learners. How do you pick the one who's the lifelong learner? And the answer is, we don't know. We don't know yet. Most of our research to date has been in trying to conceptualize what the heck this thing means and its role in organizational success. And again, what we've learned so far is it's pretty darn important. The more that people develop these sort of mindsets, the happier they are, the better they are at performing, not just in their own head, but in terms of their assessments from others. So we've got a pretty good understanding that Frank's question is the right one to ask. And our next step, one of the things that we're really curious to understand next, is what are those sort of assessments, whether they're standardized or not, or are there sort of keys or indicators that we might use as proxies to get a really good guess at who the lifelong learners are. The only thing I'll offer to date, Frank, is that our research suggests looking at whether they graduated from a co-op program might be one of those things. So far, we've demonstrated that co-op students versus those who did not do co-op tend to score higher. This isn't just us. This is some research from internationally from some colleagues of ours as well. And those who have more work experience tend to score higher in a co-op program. Demographic characteristics like age and gender have no association. So you can't just pick someone who's younger versus older or some sort of gender information. So we don't know, but we're on the case. We're dying to know. And if anyone has ideas or best practices of how they've done it, please email worklearn@uwaterloo.ca, because we want to know. We want to explore those ideas further.
Great. Thanks so much, Dave. And you're absolutely right. This is a burning topic of interest for us, and we hope to be able to come back to you soon with what we've learned from some subsequent research studies. Melanie, we have another question for you that came in from Carrie. Carrie's wondering if you've found that implementing a lifelong learning strategy has helped with retention at GEOTAB.
Yes. Thank you, Carrie. That's a great question. Absolutely. So, I talked in some of my earlier slides around lifelong learners, feeling more engaged. And I think that that's definitely been the case with implementing some of the programs that we have. Employees that are more engaged or, likely to stay with us, obviously, for a longer period of time and hopefully grow within the organization. I think programs like upskilling, for example, has really helped that. Even the career exploration program that we've implemented, I think is really important because it gives the employees the opportunity to see that there are opportunities within the organization without having to leave, right? So I think that that plays a really big part in the retention of our staff because they don't have to go somewhere else to get the experience or to even pivot into a new role or a new part of the business, right? So absolutely, we've seen some great success from that.
Thanks so much. That's such an interesting comment about the exposure to opportunities, because it's something that we've seen through our research as well, that even with students starting to think about whether or not they would be interested in returning to an organization, oftentimes it's in seeing that breadth of opportunities that exist. And I think that that's something that's incumbent upon all of us to help to maybe explicitly carve out those career paths for people, but really just awareness of the many ways in which our specific organizations can help our staff members grow and develop and thrive as we navigate all of this change. Just with a quick note at the time, I think we will move into wrap up right now. If we didn't get a chance to answer your question, or if you have any additional questions for us, or Dave's request of the magical instrument to identify lifelong learners, please pop it into the chat. Of course, we would love for you to stay in touch with us at the WorkLearn Institute. You can sign up for our newsletter, which is on the WorkLearn website. And we are planning our next Future Ready Workforce Series webinar on September 21st, so save the date. We also do have a short survey for you to complete before we end the session today. On the right-hand side under that Stage tab, you should find an event survey. If you click Start Survey at the bottom and take a minute or two to give us some feedback, we would really, really appreciate it. Otherwise, we will say thank you so much to everyone for joining us today. We are so pleased to be able to connect in with you, and we look forward to seeing you again in September. Have a great day, everyone.